It's August 8th, 2024. This is Roqe. Hi there, welcome to episode 334 of Roqe. I'm Jian Gomeshi. Hello to you from Canada, from Toronto. Salam Dostan Aziz, Durud Bar Shoma. I hope you're doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. A special edition of Roqe today, looking at the role of Farah Diba, Queen Farah, in the rise of Iranian art and culture, and the very special, powerful, and intimate role she played in the visibility and growth and exposure and celebration of Iranian art in the 1960s and 1970s. Pega is not here for the month of August, although I can see Super P is here, Savi Roham is here. We are halfway into our new studio, so I'm recording to you. I'm speaking to you from our new studio, but it is not complete yet. It's almost there. We're getting there. We give you this special edition in the backdrop of so much going on in the world, the U.S. election, the Middle East. Also, there have been major riots and violent demonstrations in the U.K. So where am I going next week? The U.K. I'm going to England, unrelated to the riots and violent demonstrations, of course. Going to the UK to do some meetings and see some folks, back to the homeland, one of my homelands, and looking forward to seeing some of you folks in England. Give me a shout if you're there. I will come to, and I'll bring you Canadian maple syrup or something. So I will not be here next week, but the show will be. We'll be giving you another edition as up-to-date as we can from me being in the UK. Also, before we get to this special interview today, I should announce or re-announce what we announced last week, which is that Roqe Live 3 is happening. Save the date if you are in the Greater Toronto area. Roqe Live 3 is coming Friday, September 27th. This is when we do Roqe in front of a live theater audience. This is a bigger, badder, meaner, not meaner. Well, maybe it's meaner. It's definitely more glamorous theater than we've ever been in before. We have a lineup that we're very excited about. We have not announced the lineup. We will be announcing the lineup sometime next week, including when we will be starting to sell tickets, the date that they will go on sale. We'd love you to come there. There will be some VIP tickets, some general tickets. Roqe Live 3 coming Friday, September 27th. If you're in the Greater Toronto area, save that date. To get to the topic for today, with Iran in the headlines these days, again, but not for the best of reasons. All the attention, as you know, is usually focused on the atrocities of the Islamic Republic, or the latest sham election held by the regime, or even worse, the possibilities of war and all the saber rattling between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel, etc. Amongst the elements lost in all of this, especially for those in the West who may not be familiar with Iran or Iranians, is, of course, the tremendous treasure of art and culture and tradition that comes from our heritage and our country of origin. So how do we provide a corrective for that? Well, much of the story of Persian art and culture is actually notably historic, stretching back centuries. But when it comes to the rise of more modern art and culture and the international recognition of it, both, as I say, domestically in Iran and around the world, the story is a relatively new one. Iranian art makes a dramatic surge in the mid-20th century, and it involved the monarchy. So while the Shah of Iran usually gets most of the attention for that period on all things Iranian, it was actually the Shah Banu, his wife, that played a major role in the area of the creative sector. And she continues to today. And that's where we wanted to focus our attention on this episode of Roqe, Queen Farah. The fact is, Farah Diba, the last Empress of Iran, played a significant role in the cultural renaissance of Iran during the reign of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. As an advocate for the arts, she was instrumental in the establishment of numerous cultural institutions, including the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which housed this impressive collection of modern and contemporary artworks from both Iranian and international artists. But her vision extended beyond merely preserving Iran's rich heritage. She aimed to position Iran as a bridge between Eastern and Western cultures. Farah Diba's support for artists and filmmakers and intellectuals fostered a vibrant cultural scene in Iran, allowing for the flourishing of new ideas and artistic expression. But even more, Queen Farah's influence extended to the promotion of traditional Iranian arts and crafts, ensuring their survival and evolution in a rapidly modernizing society. She championed the revival of Persian carpet weaving, of miniature painting, and other crafts, which were celebrated both within Iran and on the international stage. Her efforts were not only about preservation, but also about innovation, as she encouraged contemporary artists to reinterpret traditional forms. Through her patronage, Iranian art gained a global audience, and the cultural legacy she helped to build continues to be recognized and appreciated long after the end of the Pahlavi dynasty. And as you know, Iranian art, culture, craft continues to resonate today. So how much did Farah Diba shape the trajectory of arts and culture for Iran in the mid-20th century? And specifically, what was her impact and influence in bringing art, culture, and museums, for example, to Iran in the 1960s and 70s? Well, to talk about this, we once again turn to someone very well placed to consider such questions. She is an Iranian-American independent scholar, an art advisor, and a curator who was the first woman museum director in Iran. Dr. Layla Diba began her career as the art advisor to the private secretariat of Farah Pahlavi. She was the director and chief curator of the Negaristan Museum of 18th and 19th century Iranian art from its inception in 1975 till 78. After moving to the United States in 79, Leila Diba acted as an advisor to museums, corporations, and foundations in Iran. Over the span of her career, Dr. Leila Diba has curated and co-curated a number of exhibitions, among them the groundbreaking Royal Persian Paintings, the Qajar Epoch at the Brooklyn Museum in 1999, and the first major international exhibition on 18th and 19th century Persian art and culture at the Asia Society Museum in New York in 2013. Dr. Diba has written and lectured extensively on Persian painting. She's also a board member of the National Museum of Asian Art and the Freer-Sackler Galleries, a member of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Iran Heritage Foundation, and a member of the Visiting Committee of the Islamic Department of the Metropolitan Museum. And right now, Dr. Layla Diba has joined me from New York City. Hello.
Hello, Jian. Nice to speak with you from New York to Toronto.
Nice to speak with you, too. Thank you so much for doing this. And as I say, I'm excited to have this conversation with you because you're so well placed to have it. Let me start in a macro sense, a broad sort of question. We naturally think of Iran, I suppose, as an artistic place based on gorgeous mosaics or calligraphy or poems or color-rich carpets. But before the intervention of Farah Diba, what was Iran's place in the world when it came to 19th and 20th century paintings and modern art?
Well, thank you for that question. It's actually very, very to the point of our discussion today about Her Majesty's role in changing, really, the image of Iran and its culture. In terms of 18th and 19th century Persian art, it was really considered as tourist art and had been collected abroad by diplomats and travelers to Iran as a curiosity, more than really serious artwork. And it was relegated in the museums where it was held in Russia and France and England, usually to the basement or to storage. So it didn't have much of a reputation. But it was in 1969, I believe, when a major collection of Qajar painting that had been formed by one of these diplomats. Two of them, actually, the Amory brothers, came on the market, and through the Shah Banu's intervention, it was purchased for Iran. And after traveling abroad in a number of cities, it was returned, repatriated, and expressly for being exhibited in a museum that would be devoted to this period and this art.
What about 20th century art? I mean, did it? If you were an Iranian artist before this period, say in the before the late 60s and the 70s, and the intervention, as I say, of Farah Diba, what would your art be worth in terms of the eyes of the global market?
Iranian modern art, that is post war art, was really relatively unknown and undervalued outside of Iran before, say, really the late 60s and 70s. Um, some Iranian artists had traveled to France and Italy particularly and received training there. And beginning in the 60s, Iranian artists began to participate in international biennales, such as Venice, especially, largely through the intervention of Marco Grigorian, who was one of the most cosmopolitan and celebrated artists. So I think the reputation of Iranian art took a big jump during the reign of the Shah Banu. But in terms of financial value, it was way behind equivalent paintings of the same era in Europe and America.
It's funny, as a kid who grew up in the West, I think of great or important historic works of art as just existing in museums. I don't I don't consider what would happen where this art would be if there wasn't museums, you know. So where
Yeah.
were the kinds of pieces that you would end up hosting in the Negaristan Museum, or for that matter, the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art? Where would they be before then?
Yes, well, that's two very different questions. As I said, Qajar art had been collected in Western museums, quote unquote, and donated to, to those institutions by the people who had brought it back from Iran. But modern and Iranian art was nowhere to be seen outside of Iran because the only place that it had been exhibited, even in the 60s, was in biennales, and after that it disappeared. So there was really no presence. I think it was when the Museum of Contemporary Art opened in 1977 that gave a tremendous visibility because it was not only for European and American modern and contemporary, but for Iranian contemporary. So, all levels of Iranian art, I think, were raised by the creation of these numerous museums, of which the Negaristan, which was 18th and 19th century art, was the first one to be opened, and that was in 1975. And if you think about it, it's really only in 3 years that all
Yeah,
these museums
yeah.
were created. So there were over seven museums were directly created under her patronage in those 3 4 years.
When you talk about the Qajar art being housed in some of those cases in Western museums, so inside Iran, up until the
Yeah.
Negaristan, would there be a place to find this stuff, at least in an aggregated way, or
Yeah, no, there was one great palace museum, which was the Golistan Palace, and that was where you would find the manuscripts, tile work, the paintings and photography of the Qajar era. But very little was on display, and there was practically no art of the early to mid 19th century. And that's what was really important because the Negaristan, the core collection that was acquired from the Amories, focused mainly on the first half of the 19th century, which, I think, was a very important era for Qadra art. So the two complemented each other once the Negaristan was open.
when did Queen Farah first start taking a personal role in wanting to build the arts and culture infrastructure in Iran?
Well, I'm afraid you'd have to ask a historian. I can only tell you from my experience by 1973, when I first met her, the plans for the museums were well advanced. And there was already in her mind a very broad vision of what she hoped to accomplish with the creations of these museums and cultural centers.
But she
So
she had
I would
started the Shiraz Arts Festival already, right?
That's right. So probably the beginnings of this much more expanded cultural scene for Iran must have begun in the late 60s, which was when the Shiraz Festival began.
By the way, I don't know where you are in New York, but apparently it's a crime scene. There's sirens going off. Although I
Yes,
guess that's New York to a certain extent.
yes, that's the background. I'm sorry I had to leave the windows open, but that way you have a lot of New York flavor in
It's
this
yes,
region.
you're keeping it very alive. Yes. Uh,
Yes, yes.
so let's get into this story, your story, because it's just fascinating to me. You're this young American born in New York with some Iranian background, of course, half Iranian, and you had visited Iran a few times. But what did you first think when you were summoned to meet with Queen Farah in the summer of 1973?
Well, as you say, I was a young Iranian American, and I was meeting my future employer and also the queen of the country I'd come home to serve. So I'm sure I was a bit intimidated, but what I remember very well is how the Shabanu put me at my ease immediately, and with her graciousness and modesty and intelligence, just joined me in a conversation. It was a conversation between two people. And I remember I realized what an honor it was going to be to work for her and help her realize this vision, even what small part I could play. So I would say I was intimidated, but, just delighted and honored to be speaking with her.
What do you think she liked about you?
Uh, it's funny. I was thinking about this audience, but I think it was actually also an interview, Jian, because we had not met face to face, and
Right,
she
right.
was entrusting this unknown with her precious collection of Qajar art. I mean, I wasn't seeing that far forward, but she was, because I was hired really to work in Her Majesty's private secretariat, which was the nucleus of all the planning and execution of the
But
museums.
you're a kid at the
So,
time. I mean, you're not some long in the tooth museum director. I mean, it says something about her. I think that she
yes,
would pick you.
yeah.
It's very interesting.
Well, I was only one of a group of cots. We were between like 5 and 10. Youngish people who had received training abroad and who were trying to bring professionalism or modernity, if you like, to the museum system. And I think she really had a vision for the future, and she wanted to have young people involved. So as she looked at me, she would have seen a young person who shared her vision for this future of Iran, and who had recent training in the presentation and education and conservation, all the modern museum methods that were needed. So I hope she saw someone that she saw was qualified, and also a woman, and as you say, very young. Even today, there are not many young women who are museum directors. So I think it was a moment in time that coincided with a whole generation of younger Iranians and in the arts. And thankfully, we could be of use to the Shabanu and her plans for the country.
You obviously took the gig. You know,
I did.
and I wonder what you made of her personally at the time. Again, from the perspective of someone who's I've grown up always knowing that there was this, Queen Farah, and she's always been this important, regal, older figure. I mean, when I actually think about it and do the math and go, by the early 70s, she's just in her early 30s. I mean, she's a young woman taking
Yes.
on this role, besides being the queen, I mean, of sort of saying, I'm going to try to reshape the way, Iran is seen artistically or culturally. Tell me what you made of her personally in that moment, in that first meeting. Of course, you'd get to know her after that.
Well, there's a famous movie with Tom Cruise and Renee Zellweger in which she says, "You had me at hello."
Yes,
You remember that line?
of course.
Well, that applies to me. So I was immensely impressed, as I said, with her modesty, her graciousness, her simplicity, and kindness, really. She was not intimidating at all, and she was very open. To have a conversation with a young 25-year-old is pretty rare among the Iranians of another generation. But as you say, there was not that much of a difference in ages between us. And of course, I think there was a certain level of comfort because I was married to her second cousin. So I think we both felt a little comfortable in that it was family. We were talking to family.
Give me your perspective as somebody who's now worked in this field for decades. What did building and opening museums mean to Iran at the time?
Well, for me, um, it was a very important statement about joining the world, about becoming a first world country, and about Iran's equal right to a place in the world of culture as much as any European country. What we describe as the center and the periphery. In terms of culture, I saw Iran becoming a center of culture and art through the creation of these museums. And I think another thing that was important to me is that we all know there are still today colonialist and Orientalist attitudes towards Iranians that can be demeaning
Sure.
and disrespectful. And I felt that the museum culture was part of this. So it was this idea, oh, well, Iranians could never build a modern museum, or Iranians could never understand contemporary Western art. I think that we all had shared this vision of wanting to prove them wrong, in a sense, and the importance. And I think the logic of that vision is that these museums, except for mine, at which, as I said, unfortunately, the collections were removed. The other museums have had a tremendous success in the last 40 years, and they're primarily responsible for a lot of the tourism and the income that Iran gets today from international as well as local tourism. So I think this was an important step for Iran to be viewed as equal to all the other developed countries in the world.
When it comes to, as you just called it, your museum, the Negaristan, it's the first of the ones that were built in that period to open, as you say, and it's 1975. You get the job in 73, so there's this 2-year period there where
Yes.
you're obviously involved in curating and collecting the pieces that would end up filling the Negaristan Museum. What was that process like? How taxing was it to try and find and put all of this stuff in one place?
Well, I must emphasize that I was not the one who purchased the artworks until much later when I was just the last year. So when I went back to Iran, I was a very junior member of a team that already existed in Her Majesty's private secretariat. Of the head of the secretariat was Karim Pasha Bahadur, and then the art advisors Yahya Zoka and Mohsen Furuki. And these were the gentlemen who really helped the Shah Banu to put the collection together. Um, and it continued when I was there, but I was really a junior member of the group. And so the first year when I was in Her Majesty's Secretariat. I worked on various projects, uncrating art, creating seminars, beginning with research. And the second year, we barreled forward with the head of our section of the Secretariat. It was a gentleman called Firuz Shirvanlu. And so essentially, we were always a team. And as a team, I was responsible with Firuz for all the events pertaining to the opening, meaning some of the installations, the publications, the printings, the poster, and the events. So all of these were transpired in the first 6 months, in 6 months before we actually opened the museum. And for the museum opening, because Firuz was very knowledgeable about publishing and printing, we brought out a Persian translation publication of important articles on Safavid and Qajar art, reprinted others, and produced a lot of visual materials from slides to brochures. There was an incredible video film that was done by a Czech architect called Professor Fritsch. And all of these materials, actually, Jian, stayed with me. I brought them with me when I left Iran in 1978. And in the last year or two, I began researching the history of my museum, quote unquote. And thanks to all these materials, visual materials and printed materials, I think I can evoke now the life and actually the later history of this museum. So that's going a little bit further than what you'd asked, but I think I answered your initial question.
I don't really know where this question, the answer to this question will go, but and maybe it's a naive one. But given the sensitivities of the changing seats of power in Iran over the centuries, was there ever a concern or fear of somehow canonizing a previous era, the Qajar era, for example? Was there? Did you detect any sensitivity around that? Well, we don't want to make this regime from 100 or 200 years ago look too good.
Not at the time. I was young. I was, as I said, 25, I think, and I was very focused on the artistic and cultural achievements of that era, as I would be on any era, whether it was the Mongols or the Timurids or whatever, because I came to this with a background in Islamic art and a strong sense of the very long cultural history of Iran. But that was not true for everyone. On both sides of the equation, you had descendants of the Qajar families who felt that the art had been neglected during the Pahlavi era. And then you had people on the other side who felt that this was a sort of a period of Iranian decline. And so they did not feel that the art was of that great an interest. I think we proved both of them wrong. The creation of a museum to celebrate this tradition is really about recognizing the art of any era. And also, the creation, the actual creation of the museum, I think, was a very important statement.
There's a story you've told me about in terms of the direct involvement of Queen Farah Diba. The story about how she visited right before the opening, like you guys were still vacuuming or something.
Yes.
Yes. Tell me that story.
Well, I remember, I particularly remember her on this, the museum had 2 floors of galleries, and we were, it must have been just the day or the day before the opening, and, we were cleaning everything up and vacuuming the carpets. Upstairs, we had carpeting. And Her Majesty came and, just to have a look through, and I felt, very much that she was really checking up on all the details as she was known to do. She would make sure the garbage was taken out, and the windows were cleaned. And it was a great feeling of that we were being supported and recognized and helped by having her come. But it certainly was a surprise. Yes,
it's quite interesting that the personal interest that
yes.
she had. Right, it's not a sort of
Yeah.
first lady starts a foundation kind of thing. It's like she's actually, doing her version of rolling up her sleeves and, getting involved.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as you say, it's her personal involvement and attachment to these projects, I think, that made them happen. Her commitment, as you say, it was not from, high up first lady of the realm, but it was literally, and she really, really intended this for the Iranian people, and wanted us to make it available and make it accessible and engage audiences. And so I think she had a very strong personal commitment, and I think she also knew her country and her citizens, that things can go wrong and somebody has to come and have a last look over.
Can I ask you on a personal level, Dr. Diba, what it meant to you to become, in the years after that, the first woman director of a museum in Iran?
Well, it was an incredible opportunity for a young woman, which I was very conscious of at the time. Um, what is interesting is that in those 5 years, and I speak for myself, but for everyone involved in the arts, we had such opportunities to study art, to get to know the collectors, to create. That in those 5 years, we probably accomplished more than we would have in decades working in other institutions, and largely because we were given the power to do so. We had the authority, we had the funds. It was a remarkable era. And so, without knowing it, I actually laid the foundations for my later career abroad, because after I left Iran, I was determined to get my PhD. I had an MA, but that was not enough. So I needed to get a PhD. And I was offered a job at the Brooklyn Museum, but I was offered that position because they had a collection of Qajar art. And again, I found myself in a situation where I had a great deal of support from my mentors and superiors, and we were able to create an exhibition that was almost equivalent to a museum. That was the Qajar epoch in terms of scope and breadth. So those few years me with immense, invaluable experience that is I cannot be duplicated.
I mean, there's certainly an argument to be made that Iran at the time, or still, is a patriarchal culture. Did you face challenges? In terms
You
of?
know, actually, I'm again delighted you're asking that question, because I worked in the Shabanut Secretariat almost 2 years, and I found it to be a welcoming culture. There were a lot of young people. There was not a sort of autocratic system, if you like. I think it was being run more like a modern institution, and that we were a team. And I did not face any discrimination of any kind, neither there nor when I was running the museum. There were some people, there was a certain level of jealousy afterwards among the older white bearded gentlemen, as we call them, that this young woman had been put in charge, but that's normal and natural. But because we had the Queen's support, I think we were allowed to do our job, and certainly the atmosphere in her secretariat was very the culture was very positive and quite good for women.
It's heartening to hear that. I know you didn't directly work on the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, but surely you were there at the time and you were part of that secretariat. Tell me about the development of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tehran. What did Queen Farah want to do with that museum?
Well, she had a double vision for that museum. One was to be a showcase for modern Iranian artists, and the other to be the repository and a collection of international modern and contemporary art. So it had a dual function. And I think it was part of her vision. The Negaristan and the Tomoka were complementary to each other. Because how can you have 20th century without the 19th, right?
Right. And by Tomoka, you mean the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art or Musée Honarhay Muasir, right?
Right, and my museum, by the time the revolution happened, we had about 3,000 artworks. I don't know how many were in Tomoka, but I do know approximately how many were in mine, and that's why I would claim that it was, in global terms, the largest collection and museum of Qajar art in the world. For Tomoka, obviously, I was very busy with my own museum. We were doing, like 2 temporary exhibitions a year, and there was a lot of work in the museum. I went to the opening. I was, it was really thrilling to see that museum opening, to see the carpet museum opening. Um, these these institutions, I mean, we needed all the support we could get because they were revolutionary in their day. There was no concept in Iran. The museum was a Western product, actually, Jian. And if you think of the Golestan Museum, it really was not open to the public the way we would imagine. It was very
Huh.
difficult to get in. It was impossible to get into the library and see the manuscripts. And even the few times I visited, there was not much art on view. Of course, all of that has
Is
changed.
that
But
right?
what we
Museums started in the West? There wasn't
yeah, the
like a.
concept of a museum is a Western
Huh.
concept. What we had in Iran, which is would eventually lead, I think, to the acceptance of museums, was the concept of the treasury, of the khazaneh. And this goes back as long as, certainly the Timurid and Safavid periods, there was always a royal treasury. And this concept is slowly expanded into the idea of a royal gallery and then royal museums.
Right. Right.
So that in Iran, in the 19th century, actually, we had a museum in the Golestan Palace, and that was in the main entrance and reception area. But as a concept, it was a Western concept.
Let me ask you about that opening of Tomoka or the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. Um, because, this was considered to have the most valuable collections of modern Western masterpieces outside of Europe and North America.
Yes.
That's a pretty big deal. And this was a period. I mean, I only know this through reading the history books and seeing the photos, but I mean, this was a period when folks like Salvador Dali are visiting Tehran. How significant was this? On the world stage, how significant was this for Tehran, for Iran, when it opened in 1977?
Again, a good question. No really comprehensive history of the museums has been written, and certainly one of the things we were behind on in our country was reaching out to international news organizations and getting coverage, Jian, we were barely getting to understand that. So a lot of what happened in Iran stayed in Iran. The Tomoka got the most coverage because the collections were acquired from important American and European dealers and collectors, and they all came for the opening. So that was the only museum that really received, I think, quite a bit of coverage in the West, and the West was very much aware of, there was a lot of buzz about
Yes.
all these works that had been acquired, and its reputation only increased with time, as opposed to my museum, which was taken over by the Revolutionary Guards in 1978, and the collections were transferred over to them and never seen again. They only began surfacing a few years ago. The Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, except for a brief moment, stayed open through the entire revolution and post-revolutionary period in Iran. So it was the best known, and I think the most covered, if you like, and in Europe, and kept the interest of European, tremendous interest in Europe and America, especially when there was, as you know, a few years ago, there was a trade between one painting, a de Kooning painting of the nude,
Oh, right.
which
Yeah.
was traded for the remains of the great Shah Tahmasp Shahnameh, which were exchanged on a tarmac in Zurich. Uh, So that was happened only once. No other work has been deaccessioned from the Tehran Museum or other museums, as far as we know, which is very good.
I want to
Yeah.
get to where these museums are at today, or not at, in the case of the Negaristan. But let me just ask you still about that period, because these developments, the building of these museums, the openings, the glamour of it, etc., they were not without their detractors, even before the revolution. How did Farah Diba, how did you respond to criticisms at the time that this was a wasted use of resources in a country that had only moved from being a developing nation a decade or two before?
It's really strange, and maybe I was not in tune, but I really never heard any criticisms. I think museums and art were viewed more positively, perhaps, than the Festival of Shiraz, which I think drew a lot of criticism because it was so avant garde and because it took place in the middle of an urban setting. Whereas our museums, they were in parks, they were in historic buildings, or they were new buildings in historic parks. And I think they were treated more. Either people ignored them because, as I said, this concept of museum going didn't exist in those days the way it does today, or they were simply they were approved of by people. In those 4 or 5 years, I don't recall anything negative coming my way. And I think overall, of the many aspects of modernity that were introduced during those 2 decades, museums were the most positive, and for that reason, they kept most of them open.
I did read a couple of negative articles, but funny enough, they were from journalists or columnists outside of Iran saying why is this money being spent, et
Yes.
cetera, at the time,
Well, I didn't read those, but Jian, my answer to that would be that's another example of colonialism. With all the resources we had, I think we had a perfect right, and it's very important to allocate funds for culture. Look at America today, where if we don't have the arts and we don't have the culture, where will our society be?
Right.
So I do think that was again a sort of I'm quite sensitive to remnants of colonialism. People are even unconsciously using them, and I think part of that was, well, this is a Middle Eastern country with a desert and some oil. Obviously there's poverty. If there's poverty, you can't have museums. Well, obviously, I'm not going to agree with that.
There's something I want you to help me work out, because the revolution happens. Obviously, the Negaristan Museum is shut down. The Pahlavi family are in exile. You have to leave, and you can't come back. It's curious to me. I can't figure it out why they would shut down. I mean, they being the Khomeini regime, after it consolidates the revolution, why they would shut down the Negaristan Museum, but not the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which I would think would be, filled with
Major.
a bastion
Yeah.
of sort of the evil,
Yes.
American arts and things like that. So, can you work that out for me? What was the
Well,
thinking around that?
yeah, I've tried to reconstruct it myself, as you know, because I left in December '78, and the museum was occupied in February '79. And thank goodness I had a wonderful staff who stayed there, took care of the works, make sure the museum wasn't looted. I can't tell that story because I wasn't an eyewitness, but I know of it. The principal reason was the location of my museum. My museum was located at the intersection of then Koch and Sepah, and it was right next to the Senate, and it was within this large park where the royal residences were located. So it was literally in the same area as the Marble Palace Museum of the Reza Shah period and smaller family palaces of the Pahlavis. So what happened is, I think it was just a question mainly of real estate. Uh, uh, as I've explained in my lectures about the museum, the way I reconstructed it is there were many, new organizations and roving bands, and real estate was, very valuable, and especially this was a prime choice for real estate. and the Revolutionary Guards occupied it. I mean, they would not have been interested in occupying the Carpet Museum or Tomoka because of its location. But this was very
Interesting.
convenient for them, and that's the way I've reconstructed it. Another aspect is, of course, that the paintings were closely associated with monarchy and with royal authority because they were all produced for the court. And my collection had the most wonderful paintings and portraits of Fatali Shah and of the court ladies and of the dancers. And it's possible that they could have been offended by the imagery because they were, as you know, at the beginning, very, very traditional and a traditional aspect of Islam as a religion. It's against imagery. But none of these paintings were on the wall. I had them all removed, and they were all in the basement. So I think the reason was primarily, as I said, wanting to take over a piece of real estate.
It doesn't. I mean, the more tragic part is the inexplicable lack of care and sensitivity around these works of art that has been expressed over the last 40 years. Where, from what I understand, even you don't even know where a lot of this collection is. You spoke about 3,000 pieces of 18th and 19th century Iranian art. You've done a lecture called Art in Peril. In brief, obviously, can you tell us what is in peril and what you've discovered about where this art might be?
Well, over the last few years, through research and discussions with colleagues and eyewitnesses, I more or less reconstructed what happened. But there are huge lacunae, Jian, about the early years of the revolution and about all the collections that were confiscated and what happened to them. This is a very touchy and sensitive subject still, but now, 20, 30 years later, people are more open to discussing it. All we know is that many collections were confiscated. They were stored someplace. I believe there was like a museum of confiscated works. And then at some point, slowly, about 20 years later, in the 1990s, the government began using this repository as a source for enriching other museums. So as these other museums started putting up Qajar paintings and publishing, I was able to determine that about 30 odd of the paintings from the Nigaristan were now on view in the Saadabad Museum. And I was able to determine from eyewitnesses and friends that the coffee house painting collection might be in the Reza Abbasi Cultural Center and some of the lacquer work in the Reza Abbasi Center. But this is hearsay. Nothing is documented. So it's, such a small percentage of what I know was in the museum that has now surfaced. And as I said, I'm encouraging the current authorities to document and to be accountable for what happened to the rest of the collection.
And how's that going?
No response so far, but I'm always an optimist.
Right. What's the status of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art these days?
Well, it's a very important museum internationally. They were supposed to, at least one big project a few years ago was to send works abroad to Berlin and Rome. And unfortunately, that fell through at the last minute. So there was a tremendous amount of interest and expectation on that museum. And the museum, functions. It did some interesting projects the last few years. And I haven't heard anything recently, but as far as I know, it's had different directors. But the collections are still there. There are two big catalogs of the collections, which has helped to preserve the integrity of the collection. Two very good large catalogs of both the European and Iranian collections. So I don't know what they're doing today. I think they did an exhibition associated with Parviz Tanavoli.
Yes.
And both his lion rugs and his passion for collecting. So I think it's still active. What it does not do, it has, and this is fascinating, Jian, it has had no acquisition funds since 1979. So they have not added to the collection in all this time.
So interesting.
Food for thought.
On that note, it just feels like, I mean, that decade, culturally, it's so ironic that the revolution happens, and there's all kinds of reasons the revolution happens, and obviously some of them are legitimate in terms of dissent around either political suppression or the economic issues or whatever. But culturally, that decade is so fertile, and you're on the precipice of so much happening. And I know it's a bit of a strange game to play 40 years hence, but if the revolution hadn't happened somehow, what do you think Tehran would be, what Iran would mean as a hub of international arts, museum, and painting today?
Well, it would have become a cosmopolitan cultural center that we envisioned, I think, because the country economically could have continued supporting the museums. We now had, the last year, we had the structure, we had the staff, there was a foundation created, the Farah Foundation. Each of the museums had its own budget, including acquisition. And the last thing I did for the museum was buy a painting at Sotheby's in London, which I was able to send back, and I saw it survived. So I think the museum would have continued flourishing. There were plans for more museums, Jian, than the ones we already had. And I think they would have flourished, frankly. And it would have been a center for the whole Middle East, really, because of the government support and the depth and richness of the Persian collection. And frankly, always I say, the Iranian people's love for their own art and culture.
It's a good pleasure to speak to you. It's been an education. A final question, and let's end where we started, and that is about Queen Farah. What do you believe the lasting legacy of Farah Diba is on the art and culture of Iran? Is it fair to say that Farah Diba was or did put Iran on the map when it came to arts and culture, or is that overstating things?
No, I think she herself is always modest, but I would certainly agree with that statement. But I know she would also modify it by saying, she had many people advising and helping her, and I think it's the legacy of her personal commitment, but as well of the devotion and commitment of her staff and the people of Iran who helped create these wonderful institutions and help preserve the legacy.
Thank you so much for this today. I really appreciate the time and the wisdom and the reflections.
Well, Jian, it was really a pleasure meeting with you virtually, and I do hope I enjoyed our conversation very much. It was a great opportunity for me to share with you my thoughts and memories, and to recall there's still a great deal of interest in this subject today. So thank you very much.
To be continued, I feel, inevitably. Thank you. Khodafis.
Khodafis.
Bye-bye. Dr. Layla Diba in New York. This is full time for Roqe today for episode 334. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the amazing team who put this show together. Super Parisa, Savvy Roham, Smart Pega, Bearded Omid, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kaveh. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Find our content, all of our back episodes, our videos, our funnies, everything at roqemedia.com. roqemedia.com. Find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. As ever, Mizun Bashi.